Well, today's Chav Gimel, Chav Beis, Chav Beis. And after wishing you a Chodesh Tov, let's start on Chav Aleph on Beis, 4 lines up before the end. And after the Mishnah has told us that we call up 4 people on Rosh Chodesh, Oy Minei Ula Barav Mirava, Parshas Rosh Chodesh Ketzad Korinos. How do we divide up the parsha of Rosh Chodesh amongst 4 readers, 4 Korim? And here's where we analyze the problem that Ula raises. Sav es b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim es karboni lachmi. The parsha of Rosh Chodesh, Havyon Tamya Psukim. Tamanya Psukim means there are 8 Psukim. Now, how do you divide up 8 Psukim amongst 4 Korim? Hechi Navit. Mikre Trey Tlosa Psukim. Let's say we call up 2 people, each one will read 3 psukim. That means we've gotten up to 6, and now we have 2 psukim left. Pashulei Trey. We have a principle, a rule of ein mishayrin parsha pachos psukim. We're not allowed to leave over as the last part of the parsha less than 3 psukim. We always have to leave less than 3 psukim because we're always afraid that somebody might leave in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah and he sees that there are less than 3 psukim. He thinks that the next Koreh, after he leaves, is going to be called up to read less than 3 psukim. So we always have to manage our Kriya organized in a way that we're guaranteed that there are always 3 psukim left. But here, if you divide up the 8 psukim into 2 Korim, 4 each, and then you're left with 2 psukim at the end, then you haven't fulfilled the requirement of leaving 3 psukim for the end of the parasha. Let's try another option. Nikri arba arba. Why don't we have the first 2 Korim read 4 psukim each? And then, all right, you've covered now the beginning. Let's see, I have the psukim here in front of me. So you have here, Sav es b'nei Yisrael, etc. And this is the parsha of Talmud. It's a keves echad taseba boker, and then olas tamid asuya, and then we have a keves hashini taseb bein arbayim, and finally we end up with kiniskot taseh ishay reach michach Hashem. So that gives us the entire parsha. Then we get into B'yom HaShabbat Shnei Kvatzim, which is after the Korban Talmud. We read about the Korban of Shabbos, and then we read about Rosh Chodeshim. Now, from the end of the 8 psukim, that's the unit of Korban Talmud, until the end, which means Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, we have another 7 psukim. So now we've already called up 2 Korim. We've covered 8 psukim, and now we have a balance of 7 psukim to divide up against the other 2 Korahs. Bachelei Shiva. And we have B'yom HaShabbos, that's 2 psukim. Rosh Chodeshim is 5 psukim. Hechi Navid, how do we divide up the 7 verses amongst 2 psukim, 2 Korah, 2 aliyahs? Nikri Trei Miha, V'chad Miha. Perhaps we could say that the 3rd aliyah, we'll call him Yisrael number 1, right? He's going to read 2 psukim from Shabbos, and then he's going to have to read a 3rd pasuk because there's no kriya less than 3 psukim. That's going to be the first of the 5 psukim of the parasha of Rosh Chodesh. So that seems like it could be a possibility. And then what we'd have is, if let's say we covered 3, and we're left with 4 psukim for the last koreh, for the 4th aliyah. That seems feasible. Now we turn to the daf for today, which is Chav Beis, and the Gemara says that too is unacceptable because of another principle of ein maschil b'parsha pachos mishloshim psukim. if the third Koreh, now the third Aliyah, is going to read one pasuk into Rosh Chodesh, that's not acceptable because you cannot begin a parsha with less than 3 psukim. In other words, when you enter into a new parsha, you have to read the minimum of 3 psukim into the parsha. And you can't stop with less than 3 psukim into the new parsha because, again, we're concerned about someone who came late. He entered into the synagogue, and the Baal Koreh has begun reading a new paragraph. He came in late. He thought that the Aliyah began with that new paragraph. So he sees that the Koreh is only reading 1 or 2 psukim. If you don't have a minimum of 3 psukim into the parsha, then the person who comes in late is going to walk away with the mistaken impression that you can call up an Aliyah with less than 3 psukim. So we have to have a minimum of 3 psukim. So the Gemara says, Likri trei miha utlasa mihanath. Again, we're up to Yisrael number 1, the third Aliyah. Let him read 2 psukim into, right, 2 psukim of the second parsha, right? And that means he's covered Shabbos. And then, why doesn't he read the minimum of the new parsha, which is the parsha of Rosh Chodesh, 3 psukim? Now you've covered 5 out of 7. Pashulei trei, you're left with 2 psukim at the end of the parsha of Rosh Chodesh. And the Gemara says that's not acceptable either, because as we said, you always have to leave 3 psukim before the last Koreh finishes Aliyah, because if the latecomer sees, or I should say the early leaver, he checks out and he sees that the less than 3 psukim left to the parsha, he's going to think that the next Koreh is going to be reading less than 3 psukim. So Rabbi responds to Ula, and he says, Zulo Shamati, I can't say that I heard the answer to your question. This appelled to me. How did Rabbi not know the answer to this question when every Rosh Chodesh this question comes up? By that I can't figure out. But Kayotzi B'zeh Shamati, I heard a different discussion which has to do with the Mamados on a Tainus Tzibur, and we can learn from that discussion that addresses the Mamados, and by analogy, we can answer your question about Rosh Chodesh. The Snad we learned in the Mishnah Masechet Tainus. Bayom Harishon, on the first day of the Mamados, is Bereshis V'hi. We read the 2 parshios of Bereshis and Vayehi Rakia, which means that from Perek Aleph of Bereshis, we're going to read the first 5 psukim, which is called Bereshis, and then we're going to read the next 7 psukim, that's Pasuk Vav, Zayin, and Ches, which is the parsha of Yehi Rakia. And that's the Mishnah in Tainus. Now again, Ma'amados, we said, were people who were organized as representatives of Klal Yisrael to stand over a Karban Tzibur in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishnah tells us that at the Ma'amados of each day of the week, they would read Parshas in the Torah. They would call up 3 people to the Torah for those kriyos. And on the first day, which is Yom Rishon, they would read 2 paragraphs into the Torah. The first 2 sections or parshas in the Torah that have respectively 5 and 3 psukim. So we're stuck again with a situation where we have to divide up 8 psukim amongst 3 korim. V'tani Allah, Bereshis b'shnayim, Yehi Rakia b'echad. That we start with Bereshis, and we have 2 people divvying up Bereshis. But again, that's only 5 psukim. So how do you divvy up 5 psukim amongst 2 korim? And then you begin the parsha of Yehi Rakia for the 3rd koreh. Now that's okay because the parsha of Yehi Rakia has 3 psukim. So that we've covered. But as far as the parsha of Bereshis, it has 5 psukim. How do you divide that up according to the Mishnah rules, amongst two Korim, two Aliyahs, Ravin and Ba, and we analyzed this Mishnah and we came up with the following question. Mishnah Mehira Kia Echad. Okay, the three psukim, Tulsa psukim Avi, that's fine. But Ela Brachis, but the first five psukim in the Torah, which is called Parshas Brachis, B'shnayim, you're dividing it up into two people. Chabisha psuki Avi, how do you divide up five psukim amongst two people? The Tanya Rebbe Brisa. HaKorei b'Torah lo yivchos mishlosha psukim. So the minimum amount of psukim that you allow to read, the barest minimum is 3 psukim. So how can you have two korim that are dividing up 5 psukim? It means one is going to read 3, the other is going to have to read 2. And here we have machlokes in the Masechet Tainis, which is quoted here in the Masechet Megilla, between Rav and Shmuel. How to solve the problem of divvying up 5 psukim amongst two people. Rav Amar Dileg. Dileg means to repeat. So this is the first time that we're encountering a repetition of a pasuk in the framework of Kriya, and we're going to apply it to Rosh Chodesh as well. So what you're going to do is you'll have the first Aliyah read 3 psukim, and you're left with 2 psukim. The second Aliyah will repeat the third pasuk a second time around, and then add the 2 new psukim to make up the minimum of 3 psukim. Shmuel Amar Posek, Shmuel says, we're going to take the middle pasuk of the 5 and split it into 2. The first Olah will read 2.5 psukim. That means 2 full psukim, and then the half pasuk of the third pasuk. And then the next Olah, number 2 on the list, he'll read the second half of pasuk Gimel, and then the 2 full psukim to make up the 5. And the Gemara now analyzes this machlokes. Rav Amar Doli, my time Amar Posek. Why did Rav reject Shmuel's possibility? Because we're not allowed to split a pasuk. We have a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu about the Seder HaPsukim, and when a pasuk begins, when it ends. We're not allowed to split a pasuk in half. Shmuel Amar Paskinale, he's not bothered by this problem of splitting a pasuk in half. For example, when a teacher teaches in Cheder, Tashbar, Tinokos Beis Rabban, he very often has to split up the pasuk in order to explain part of the pasuk and the other half of the pasuk. And we'll do the same thing with Kriyas HaTorah. But Amar Rav Chananya Kara, okay, that was his name. He was Kara, he was like the expert on Kriyas HaTanakh. Sar Gadol Hayali Eitzel Rabbi Chanina HaGadol. And I tried to sort of push Rabbi Chanina HaGadol to agree that we would be allowed to split a pasuk in half. Below Hitili lifts up. But he would not allow me to leniently rule that a Balkori could split a pasuk in half. Ella, the only license that was able to squeeze out of Rabbi Chanina HaGadol was the Tinokos Beis Rabban. Oh, Islamet Asuyin. Since you're teaching children, it's absolutely necessary to sometimes divide up a pasuk and teach one half of the pasuk first, take a pause, and then teach the other half of the pasuk. So how could Shmuel say that you can split up a pasuk? We seem to learn here that Chanina only allowed it for the case of teaching Torah to children. And Shmuel answers, why are we allowed to divide up a pasuk in the case of a Rebbe teaching to a Talmidim Mishum Delo Efsa? There's no way that you can achieve your goal pedagogically and successfully without splitting up a pasuk. That's called lo efshar. It's Hachanami here too on Rosh Chodesh, lo efshar. Again, we'll soon see why Shmuel rejects the possibility of Rav of Doleg, meaning to repeat psukim. Shmuel doesn't accept that possibility. The door is closed, and on Rosh Chodesh we have no other option. Our back is against the wall. The only possibility is to split a pasuk in half. And the same heter that Rav Chanina HaGadol gave for the Malamdei Tinokos, we're going to apply here to the case of Kriyas HaTorah. Now the Gemara wants to address the question why Shmuel rejected Doleg. We understand why Rav rejected Posek, because you can't split a pasuk in half. And according to Rav, since you have another option, namely Doleg, so it's not a situation of lo efshar, therefore we're going to go with Doleg. And Rav has no problem with Doleg. Shmuel, on the other hand, has a problem with dolig, and that hence he's left with no other possibility, no alternative other than posek, and it's lo efshar. Shmuel Amar Posek my time Amar dolig. Why does he reject Rav Shita of dolig? And when it says Gzera mishum anechnasim ubishum ayotzim, again we have to worry about people who come late in the middle of the kriya, or they go early and they don't hear the end of the kriya, and now you're repeating psukim. And if you're going to repeat psukim, then let's say, for example, the first aliyah, right? He reads the first 3 psukim of the 5 psukim of that parsha called Tamid, the parsha Tamid, the first of the parashas. Now we call in the second Koreh, and what he's going to do is he's going to read the balance of that parsha, and that means we're left with 3 psukim, plus he's going to read the last 2 psukim. So if somebody comes into the shul and he hears the second reader, the second Koreh who began with Pasuk Gimel, then he may think that the reader that came before him, he wasn't there in shul, only read 2 psukim. So it's very nice that you have the, Rav Shita of Dole, and the second Koreh is going to repeat that third pasuk. But then when he starts his kriya with that third pasuk, repeating pasuk number 3, then the person who enters into the shul late comes out with a mistaken impression that the previous Koreh that he didn't hear, he wasn't in shul, only read 2 psukim. Now we have another problem if somebody leaves early. Because if he leaves early and the second Koreh repeated the third pasuk of the first parsha plus 2 psukim into the second parsha, and therefore he who leaves early walks out with the mistaken impression that the second Koreh will read, in other words, the Koreh that comes after will only read 2 psukim. That's all that's left in that parsha. Meisvei, we're going to ask a kasha. Now, this kasha, I was of the impression, is on both Rav and Shmuel. However, the Masechet has a different girsa, and according to his girsa, the kasha is only on Rav and not on Shmuel. So we'll see as we go along. The Brisa says that Parsha shel Shisha Psukim Korin also b'shnayim. That's fine. You have a parsha that has 6 psukim divided amongst 2 korim, 2 aliyahs. Each one will read 3 psukim. That's fine. However, what do you do in the following cases? B'shel chamisha psukim b'yachid. You have 5 psukim, and you don't want to divide it up into 2 korim because then you'll be stuck with the old problem of 3 and 2. So what you're going to do is you'll read all 5 psukim for 1 korim. Korah Rishon Shlosha. What happens if out of the 5 psukim in this parsha, the Korah Rishon read 3? Asheni Korah Shnayim Parsha Zu v'Echad Parsha Acheres. Let the next Korah read 2 psukim and then 1 pasuk into the next parsha. However, that really raises a problem, because if you're reading only 1 pasuk in the next parsha, then someone who came late thinks that you started your career with the beginning of the parsha, you only read 1 pasuk. Therefore, Yeshua, remember another opinion, is Shlosha, that the second Korah would certainly read 3 psukim into the next parsha. If, according to you, meaning the Tanakama, you're going to only enter into the new parsha 1 pasuk, then someone who comes in is going to mistakenly think that you only read 1 pasuk in that parsha for that Korah. Now the Gemara asks the kasha on Rav and Shmuel. Tim Isa, if you can accept Rav, Laman the Omedolik, Nidlog, why doesn't the Brisa offer Rav's solution? And that is to repeat psukim. So you're stuck with a situation of a parsha, let's say, that has only 5 psukim. Fine. Chamisha psukim b'yachid is Korah Rishon b'shlosha v'asheni Korah Shnayim. Why? You have 5 psukim. Why not have the second Ola repeat the last pasuk, number 3 of the previous Koreh? Hence, the previous Koreh has read 3 psukim, and now the Koreh has read 3 psukim as well. So that's the kasha, the objection to Rav. Ulamad Yomer Posei. Now we want to raise an objection to Shmuel Nifsog. Again, you have 5 psukim. Why not take pasuk number 3 and split it in half? And the first Koreh will read 2.5. The second Koreh will read half and 2. So we're into Shani Hasam, the Efsha Bahachi. When did Rav and Shmuel come up with their solutions? In the case of Mamados, there was no other possibility. But here, there's another possibility. You could read more and deeper into the next parsha. And there's no reason to assume you can't do so. In the case of Mamados, you can't do so because there's a theme. And you can't add extra psukim afterwards which are not relevant to the theme. We have the same problem with Rosh Chodesh because we end with Rosh Chodesh, the parasha of Karbonis Rosh Chodesh, and anything beyond that is already a new sugya. Amar Rabbi Tanchum, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Halacha ki yesh omrim. We paskin like the yesh omrim. You must read a minimum of 3 psukim into the parasha. The Amar Rabbi Tanchum, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kishem she'ein maschilim beparsha pachos mishlosha psukim. Right, when you enter into a new parsha and you begin reading it, you must read a minimum of 3 psukim because someone who comes late will think that you didn't read 3 psukim. He thinks you started at the beginning of the parsha. And so too, kach ein mishayrim the parsha pachos mishlosha psukim. When you get to the end of the kriya, don't leave less than 3 psukim. Let's say you get to the end of a parsha, and you almost to the end of the parsha, but you have another pasuk with 2 psukim left in the parsha. The person who leaves the shul early is going to think that the aliyah following him after he left is going to only read the balance of that parsha, which is only 1 or 2 psukim. So we have to make sure that we enter into a parsha reading 3 psukim, and when we finish the kriya, we have at least 3 psukim left in the parsha. So the Gemara asks Shita, why did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi have to give us the second scenario? And Paskin that did. It's obvious. Hashta umaya schalta. When we're speaking about beginning a parsha, they called Mekil Tanakama. The Tanakama was the one in this previous price that we studied who is Mekil, and he allowed you to go 1 pasuk into the next parsha in order to give the second Koreh a unit of 3 psukim. And Machmir Yeshom, but the Yeshom were Machmir, and they said, no, when you start a parsha, you have to read a minimum of 3 psukim into the parsha. Is now when we get to the end of the parsha and how much you're allowed or not allowed to leave over when you complete the kriya before the end of the parsha. And Shir the Machmer Tanakama, the Tanakama himself agrees and concedes that with regard to Shir, you need a minimum of 3 psukim, because again, if you would finish within 3 psukim at the end of the parsha, and you would divide up 5 psukim amongst 2 korim, one reading the first 3 and the other reading the last 2 psukim, continuing into the next paragraph, the Tanakhama says that in the case of a 5 psukim unit in a parsha, you have to read it with one person. One person will read all 5 psukim. So it's quite clear that you're not allowed to leave over 3 psukim at the end of the parsha. Why did Rabbi Tanchum Paskin, in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, like the Yesh Omrim? Why do you have to emphasize that in Shiur, he's got to make sure that he's Meshayr at least a minimum of 3 psukim? That's obvious. So the Gemara answers, but Yotzim lo shchichi. It's more common to worry about people who come late than people leave early. Which, if you ask me, that's a fella to say such. But we're assuming that the people listening to Kriyas Torah, they came to shul, they know something. They're not total ignoramuses, and they are shomer mitzvahs. All right, so he came late. What could he do? But coming late is very common. And therefore, we should certainly paskin that you don't begin a new parsha with less than 3 psukim, because the person who comes late, he wants to be convinced that there were 3 psukim read. But yotzin it's lo shchich, to be afraid at the shiur, at the end of a parsha, for yotzin, that somebody might leave prematurely and come to a mistaken impression that the next Koreh beyond his exit is going to read less than 3 psukim. That's who leaves it early. Manchi Sefer Torah v'nafki? Are you going to leave the Sefer Torah open and walk out of shul? That would be an insult to the Sefer Torah. So wait at least till after Kriya. And that's why Reb Shua ben Levi has to tell me that even with regard to shiur, we're going to paskin like the Yesh Omrim, and we have to leave at least 3 psukim at the end of the parsha when we conclude the Kriya. Tanakama concedes that with regard to shiur, we have to be machmir. And the reason for that is because of yotzim. Mishum yotzim, somebody who leaves early and he sees there are only 2 psukim left to the parsha, he's going to mistakenly think that the next kriya is only 2 psukim. Is askuli nami gzera mishum anichnosim. But we said that the nichnosim, those who come in late, are more common than those who leave early. So certainly, according to Tanakama, in the case where you're worried about those who come in late, and therefore you want to guarantee that the psicha should have at least a minimum of 3 psukim, why is the Tanakama poo-pooing? In other words, he's only concerned about somebody who leaves early. The manchi sefer Torah v'nafki. And he's not concerned about somebody who comes late. So the answer is, Amri Amai Amman Di'ayil Shiyule Shaila. So what does this mean? Mandi Aili Shiyule Shaila. So the one who's leaving early is going to ask questions. No, I'm sorry, Mandi Ayil. Ayil doesn't mean nothing. I mean, he's coming into the shul. He's what you call nichnasim. And he's going to ask a question. What's happening here? He came in the middle of Kriyas Torah, and he hears that the Koreh begins with the second pasuk. Right? So what's going to happen? In the Gemara's Kasha here, on the Tanakama, the objection, he might come to the conclusion that the Kriyas Torah began in the second pasuk. So the answer is he's going to surely ask other people, what do you mean the Baal Koreh started in Pasuk Gimel, means the previous Ola only read 2 psukim? Is that so? No, people have that general knowledge that you read 3 psukim. So he's going to ask and inquire, why did this happen? So therefore, we're not worried about the nichnasim, the latecomers, that they'll walk out with a mistaken impression. Sholachlei Rabbi Berei the Rav Yosef Hilchas Amai. How do we paskin? Sholachlei Hilchas Adolet. We paskin like Rava Dolet. Again, previously we had paskin like the Yesh Omer, and that for sure we're going to accept. And we need that when you enter into a new parsha, you read a minimum of 3 psukim. But now we're saying something else. That if there are only 5 psukim to divide it up amongst 2 korim, then what do? We have a repetition. In the second korim, we repeat the last pasuk number 3. Dolgam, that's Rav Shita. Now the Mishnah says that klal kol sheish bo musaf. If there's a korban musaf, which refers to both Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, then we call up 4 people to the Torah. Boilu, Tainus Tzibur Bakam. How many Korim should we call up on a fast day? And the Gemara now analyzes the question. Rosh Chodesh u'moed karban musaf harba. There's an extra kiddush sayom that generates a new mitzvah of karban musaf both Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed. Is therefore we want to reflect that in the Korim, and we add another Koreh. But Aval Hacha, in the case of Tainus Tzibur, there's no Kiddush Sayom on Tainus Tzibur, right? There's no carbon that we bring on Tainus Tzibur. Is Hacha the Leka carbon Musaf? Lo. Odim Achanami Ika Musaf Tefillah. Any day that's endowed with special mitzvos would possibly generate a fourth Koreh. And we have to see about Chanukah and Purim. But in any event, when we're talking about Tainus Tzibur, it has a separate mitzvah. Tainus Tzibur adds a new mitzvah of Tosefes Tefillah. And I have a feeling that the Gemara has in mind Ne'ilah. Let's see if anybody points this out. No, it's probably not Ne'ilah then. Let me offer another alternative. Perhaps it means the extra brachos that we add to Shmon Esrei. Instead of 18, we go to 24. Tashma b'Roshei Chadash b'Chol Shabbat Korah Arba. The Brisa doesn't mention a word about Tainus Tzibur. Let's deduce from this Brisa Tainus Tzibur b'Gimel. Only 3 people. It doesn't have an endowment of Kedusha Hayom. It doesn't have a separate mitzvah of Musaf. Hence, it goes back to the general Hatpori, the mixture of everybody else, which is 3 Korim. So Gemara says, Hey, Marisha. Let's see if we can slug this up by reading the beginning of the Mishnah. It says at the beginning of the Mishnah, it's an exhaustive list of those kriyos that only require 3 aliyos. Tainus Tzibur is not on the list. Arba. It implies, so this is what you call the diukim sosrim. We have one diuk from the Reisha, another diuk from the Sefer, and there's the law of the middle confusion, right? The ambiguous middle. That's what we have over here. So we really cannot draw any conclusions from our Mishnah. Tashma, maybe I can prove it from the story of Rav. The Rav ikul above Tainus Tzibur kakara b'sifra, kam kara b'sifra. So Rav got an aliyah on a Tainus Tzibur, pasach, barich, chasim v'lobar. He opened up the kriya with a bracha, but he did not recite a bracha after the kriya. Nafal kuliyala an payu v'Rav lo nafal al. Another thing that happened at that particular incident is that everyone did tachnu. They did nefilas apayim. Rav didn't do nefilas apayim because it was a Tainus Tzibur. It's really interesting that you should do away with tachnun on a Tainus Tzibur. But anyway, Michti, Rav b'Yisrael Kara, right? We don't know that Rav was a Kohen or a Levi, so he probably got the 3rd aliyah. And Rav says that there are only 3 aliyahs on a Tainus Tzibur. And if he got the last aliyah, my taima chasem v'lo birech. If he got the last aliyah, then he should have made a bracha lachrel. I mean, it's interesting that the Gemara asks about the bracha lachrel. Why didn't the Gemara ask about the bracha lefanel? Because if Rav got the last aliyah, he shouldn't have made a bracha before the kriya. Lav mishum de boy lemikri achrina basrei. It must mean that although he was the 3rd karu, but there was, somebody was waiting in the on deck circle to read the 4th aliyah. So we see that there are 4 aliyahs on a Tainus Tzibur. Where it says lo, you can't prove anything. Rav bekahani karu. Right, the halach is that if you have a Talmud Chacham, he gets first dibs, even trumps a Kohen. The Rav Huna Kari Bechahani. So it's interesting. Rav Huna becomes the precedent for this halacha that a scholar can get the first aliyah. And we don't have to give it to a Kohen. Even if the Talmud Chacham is not a Kohen, he will get the first aliyah. And from the story of Rav Kahana, we're going to extrapolate about Rav, that Rav, because of his special status as the Gadol Adar, he'll be called up to replace, and for the first aliyah. He's not replacing anyone because even if there's a Kohen in the audience, we're going to call up Rav. So if Rav got the first aliyah, just 1 second, v'lo chasim, am I right? It says Pasach ubarich chasim v'lo barich. Rav didn't make the final concluding bracha. The reason for that is because he got Kohen. He got the first aliyah. So he's not the one to do the chasima. It'll be the last Korah, which might be 3 kruim according to Rav on a tiny sima. Mishlei Rav Huna Kari b'kahani. I could justify why Rav Huna took the first aliyah. He wasn't a Kohen. Da'afilu Rav Ami, Rav Asi, the kahani chashive. The Arad Yisrael, Chashivi the Arad Yisrael. So Rav Ami and Rav Asi were the Kohanim of Eretz Yisrael. And Mechav Chayef Rav Huna, but they saw themselves as subservient to Rav Huna. So Rav Huna, therefore, was the Gadol and the Rebbe and the master, so that even Kohanim, the most important Kohanim in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Ami and Rav Asi, yet Rav Huna would take the first aliyah. But how could Rav take the first aliyah? Ika Shmuel de Kahanavi udebar aleh. Shmuel was a Kohen, and Shmuel was greater than Rav. Again, what that means, I don't know. But at least in certain areas of halacha, Shmuel was considered greater than Rav. So the Gemara has a problem. Why would Rav take the first aliyah? See, I don't understand. The Gemara knows for sure that Shmuel was present. So I don't follow that. But anyway, so let's assume Shmuel was present in the audience and Rav was subordinate to Shmuel. And therefore, how could Rav take the first aliyah? Shmuel was a Kohen. And Gemara says, Shmuel nami mechav habakai flei Rav. The relationship between Rav and Shmuel is complex. It's not that one is the Rebbe and one's the Talmud. Each one saw himself to some extent as the Talmud. And therefore Shmuel was mechav habakai flei Rav. He felt himself subordinate to Rav. But Rav hu di'ovid le kavod. The Gemara Bava Kama on Daf Pei says that Rav would allow Shmuel to enter before him as a mark of deference. That's only because Rav wanted to give special kavod to Shmuel. And this has to do with the sugya in Shabbos Kuf Ches, that Rav lied a Shmuel because Rav thought that Shmuel was not behaving with the proper respect. And as a result of the curse, the whammy that Rav put on Shmuel, Shmuel had no children. And Rav did tshuva, and he tried as hard as he could to make amends with Shmuel, giving him and bestowing upon him all the great honor. Oh, this is what we're saying, that Shmuel was not there when Rav was called up to the Torah, and therefore Rav allowed himself to take the first Kriya, and this would not be viewed as an insult to Shmuel because Shmuel saw himself subordinate to Rav. And when Rav gave special cover to Shmuel, it was only because he had to appease him, so to speak, for that time that he cursed him, that terrible incident. It's logical to assume that Rav took the Kohen position, the Rav B'Kahani Kara, the Yisal Kedaita of the Yisrael Kana, if you're going to tell me that he didn't take the first Aliyah, but rather he took the third Aliyah, is Lefanea my time of Baruch. Oh, now a question. Why did he make the first bracha? And that makes no sense. Why did he make the first bracha? Unless he was the first Korah and he was taking Korah. So the Gemara says, no, Lachar Takana. Remember we said that because of the Nechnas Yotzim, they made a Takana that every one of the Korim should recite a bracha before and a bracha after, like we have in our Minu. And the whole story here of Rav was after the Takana. Now, we said in this story that Rav made the bracha Rishona, but he didn't make the bracha Achrona, the last bracha Lachrel. If this whole incident took place after the Takana, that every single Kori reads before, makes a bracha before and after, then why did Rav omit the bracha Lachrel? Shani Hechad Yosef Rav di Miyayel Oyu. In other words, Rav was, I guess, a very a powerful drawing card for people to come in to daven. You know, they wanted to be with Rav, see Rav. But a lot of people came late to daven. So now Rav got the third aliyah. He would make a bracha b'lefanea, even if we're talking about Kodem HaTakana. And the reason for it is because he was very concerned with latecomers. And if the latecomer didn't realize that Rav was coming as the third Kori, he thought he was the first Kori, and he didn't make a bracha l'fanea, they would walk out with the mistaken impression that you don't make a bracha before the Kriya.